Hi class! So this week we're covering Chapter 8, Qualitative Research. Qualitative research involves the studied use and collection of a variety of empirical materials. These include case studies, personal experience, introspective, life story, interview, observational, historical, interactional, and visual text that describe the routine and problematic moments and meaning in individuals' lives. It is based on inductive philosophy. So inductive philosophy is when data are gathered without a specific hypothesis. Researchers may use a theoretical framework to guide their research, but not to derive a hypothesis. They want the data to generate their hypothesis. Focus is on discovering the meaning individuals give to interactions and events. So, researchers, as instruments for data collection and analysis, reflect on and track assumptions, beliefs, biases, and values brought to the research. It is central to the trustworthiness of qualitative research. Researchers need to address their subjectivity or understanding of the phenomenon. Insider researchers study a group they belong to. The advantage is that they understand the feelings and experiences of the group. The drawback is the loss of objectivity or empathic neutrality, which could also bias the research. Outsider researchers study a group to which they do not belong. The advantage is that participants share information without feeling judged. The drawback is that it may take a long time to build rapport with the participants. So in determining the researcher's role, there are several options. As an observer, there's no or minimal interaction with the participants. Observer as participants is when you're observing with some interaction with the participants. Participant observer is more interaction than observing. And then full participant is being a member of the setting in which the research is being conducted and being the one conducting the research. Qualitative research is used to study phenomenon that has not been studied or needs to be examined to gain additional insight. It is used to learn from participants about their perceptions about beliefs, behaviors, events, or social interactions. It's also used to understand a phenomenon more in depth and used in a mixed method research that employs both quantitative and qualitative methods. Qualitative research can also inform practice, policy, and service. So Table 8.1 in your textbook lists the sampling strategies along with characteristics of the sample that emerges from their use. Purposive sampling is normally employed for qualitative research. It involves selecting persons from the target population because of their fit with the purpose of the study and inclusion criteria. So it's important to consider the goals of the study so you can determine what sampling strategy you'll use. A homogeneous sample is one where individuals share similarities on some characteristics like their age, gender, racial, ethnic background. And a heterogeneous sample is one where individuals differ on those characteristics. If comparing, use a stratified purposive sample. For example, if a researcher is interested in studying the quality of social work practice in healthcare settings, they would need to stratify the sample by healthcare setting size, like small, medium, large. Do you have a specific criterion that participants need to meet to be eligible in the study? If yes, then you would use criterion sampling strategy. It involves selecting persons from the target population based on a criterion established by the researcher. If highlighting, then you would use an extreme or deviant case sampling to select participants based on having the most positive or the most negative experiences. Sample size should be based on the number of participants needed. There are some guidelines for choosing your sample size based on the type of method that you're also using. So depending on whether you use Cromwell suggestions, Patton suggestions, or Morse suggestions. So Creswell suggests 3 to 5 for a case study, up to 10 for phenomenological research, and between 20 and 30 for grounded theory research. Patton suggests that for grounding theory research, one keeps interviewing people to the point of theoretical saturation. Theoretical saturation is a process of collecting and analyzing data until all relevant information has been collected that is needed to gain complete insight into the topic. It is the point at which the researcher does not gain any more insights, identify any new themes, or develop any more coding categories. So basically, theoretical saturation is when there's no more new information. So whether you're interviewing, so during the interviews of new participants, you're not getting any more new information than what participants have already stated. That's theoretical saturation. Morse suggests 30 to 50 participants for ethnographic research. So case studies involves examining a phenomenon by studying a single case in depth. So a case can be an individual, an event, a group, family, institution, community, or any entity that can be readily defined. Case studies should be considered when the focus of the study is to answer how and why questions, you cannot manipulate the event, and your focus is on contemporary events. Case study research provides a detailed description of the phenomenon, but its results are not generalizable due to having a single case. If researchers use more than one case, generalizability is not an issue. Researchers use a constructivist perspective, which believes that development of knowledge is derived from persons' experiences and the reflecting on these experiences, and that truth is relative and dependent on one's perspective. There are 5 components of design. The research questions, a case study starts with how or why questions. Researchers state why they think a certain relationship or behavior exists. Proposition can be based on the literature, personal or professional experiences. Exploratory case studies will not have a proposition statement. Here, researchers should state the purpose of the study. Decide between analyzing the individual, program, process, or difference between organizations. Determine what the case is not. Binding a case means placing boundaries by time and place, time and activity, or definition and context. This keeps the topic from being too broad. Decide between one case or multiple cases to compare the phenomenon across the settings. Decide the purpose. So decide whether it's going to be descriptive, exploratory, or explanatory. Conduct interpretational analysis to examine data for constructs, themes, or patterns, and pattern matching to see how data provides evidence for the propositions. Examine data to see if anything indicates an alternative explanation for the findings. Use judgment rather than statistical methods to interpret the findings of the study. So these are the 5 components of the case study design. There are also 5 data sources that's used with the case study design. Documentation, so emails, letters, newspaper articles, diaries, agenda from meetings, progress reports, and any other personal documents. Archival records can be census data, statistical data, records indicating how many clients were seen, and publicly available data. Interviews can be unstructured interviews, which are more conversational, or semi-structured, which are more focused. An interview guide with a list of questions can also be used for a more focused discussion. So direct observations can involve observing behaviors, interactions with others, events persons engage in, and conversations. With participant observation, the researcher participates to some extent with the people that are being studied. So ethnographic research involves studying people or communities within their natural environment to understand their lived experiences from their perspective. Emic perspective is understanding people from their own perspective. Ethic perspective is gaining understanding from the researcher's perspective. So some examples of appropriate questions are, how effective is an opioid treatment center in Baltimore, Maryland for older adults? What are the substance use histories of youth transitioning out of foster care? What are the process and procedures that make case management effective or ineffective for traumatized youth? So these are open-ended, appropriate questions that you would use when using the ethnographic research design. The limitation is that ethnographic research takes a long time to conduct based on how long it takes to build rapport with the participants. This is both a limitation and a strength, as time in the field is a mark of rigor and trustworthiness. So, epistemology is a theory of understanding. It focuses on relationship between the known and what can be known. Ontology focuses on the nature of reality. So those are two different perspectives used with ethnographic research. So the data sources with this design: documents, interviews, observations. There's also social media or virtual ethnography. So virtual ethnography is ethnography that is conducted on the internet. It's a qualitative interpretive research methodology that adapts the traditional in-person ethnographic research techniques of anthropology to the study of online cultures and communities formed through computer-mediated communications. So there are 5 steps for conducting this research. The first is problem formulation, a statement focused on understanding certain human experiences or a way of living or a particular community and explaining why it is important to understand. Selecting a research setting is the next step. So this is the place to carry out the research study. Next is gaining access. How will one gain access to those being studied? Will the researchers ask a member of the group to introduce them to the members of the group? So presenting oneself is the next step. So how to introduce oneself to those being studied, whether it's as an observer, a participant observer, observer as participant, or a full participant. And the last step is gathering and recording information. So this is a type of data: observations or interviews, type of documents to review, whether to record observations while conducting or afterward, a notebook or a computer to record observations. Grounded theory is used to understand the meaning individuals give to events that occur in their lives to gain insight about how they react to the events and cope afterwards. With this design, the goal is to generate a theory from the data. So researchers constantly engage with and ask questions of the data. With theoretical sampling, they collect and analyze data simultaneously to generate a theory. They ask questions of the data, leading to additional data to fill gaps in theoretical formulation. Grounded theory is based on interpretivism and symbolic interaction. Interpretivism focuses on the way people make sense of the reality. Symbolic interaction indicates that people derive meanings of events due in part to their interactions with others. The strength of this design is that it can be used for theory development. It promotes deep examination at data without being constricted to look at patterns to support a theoretical framework. The limitation is that coding data can become so cumbersome that researchers lose sight of discovering themes from the data. Examples of appropriate questions for this design are: how does training for leadership and child welfare occur in schools of social work? What are the facilitators and barriers of the adoption process when it comes to the adoption of adolescents? And what do you think university administrators can do to prevent sexual assault on college campuses? So based on those questions, the researchers would collect data to then formulate a theory. There are 5 stages of conducting research for this design. Again, problem formulation. So statement of the focus of the study and why it's important. Make a decision about whom you will interview. So specific individuals or groups interviewed should be knowledgeable about the topic. Collect data and start analyzing it. So data are collected via semi-structured interviews and analyzed immediately. Researchers ask predetermined open-ended questions, but not necessarily in the order written. And additional questions may also be asked. Conduct further interviews, so specifically to inquire about theories and concepts that emerged in the previous step. And continue engaging in steps 3 and 4. So continue interviews and collect and analyze data until theoretical saturation is reached. Phenomenological research focuses on understanding the lived experience of a participant about a phenomenon. from the participant's perspective. Researchers are interested in four aspects of lived experience: space, body, time, and human interactions. It's conducted for descriptive purposes. The research is not conducted to test hypotheses and does not use theory to guide their research. Data are collected through in-depth interviews with open-ended questions. Examples of appropriate questions for this design are: what is it like to be a Hispanic faculty member in a department where you are the only one? How do you cope with having a terminal illness? What is it like to be caring for a husband who has a traumatic brain injury? So these are all questions that are asking for responses from someone's lived experience. You have to have lived it to be able to answer it. The strength of this design is that it may result in generation of new theory about the phenomenon. The limitation is that it's a time-consuming process of data collection and analysis. There are 4 steps to conducting this type of research. The first one is bracketing. So bracketing is when you identify any preconceived beliefs or notions about the phenomenon under study. Intuition. So become totally immersed in the study, remaining open to discovery based on the participant's perspective. Openness leads to more questions and additional methods of data collection. Analysis. Examine data to code, group coding categories, and develop themes that describe the phenomenon from the participant's perspective. And then description. Describe the phenomenon from the participant's perspective. So there are 5 gold standards criteria used to establish the trustworthiness of the data collected for qualitative research. These include credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability, and authenticity. So the credibility or believability of the study is enhanced by the researchers accurately describing and interpreting the participants' understanding of the phenomenon. So audio recordings are transcribed and transcripts are checked for accuracy. Member checking is getting participants to review and check if findings accurately reflect what they said and confirm the researcher's interpretation of the data. So with member checking, basically the researcher goes back to the participants and double checks that what the researcher have is actually what the participant said. Because sometimes as researchers, we might interpret things differently. And member checking basically facts check what the participant said. The drawback of member checking is that participants may disagree with the interpretation, thus calling it into question. So one disadvantage of this is that when the researcher collects the data, so they do the interview and then they go back to do member checking, so they go back and talk to the participant after writing up the results to verify that that is exactly what the participant meant, to make sure that the researcher interpreted what the participant said correctly. However, if they come back to the participant and ask, and the participant says, no, that is not what I meant, then the researcher would have to basically collect more data. So the researcher would have to interview the client. So basically the researcher would then have to ask the participant if they would be okay with clarifying the information and then collecting that information again, and then would have to redo member checking again to make sure that they did interpret it correctly this time. Negative case analysis is examining the data to determine if there are cases that disconfirm the findings. Researchers can then revise the hypothesis if necessary. Audit trail is writing a memo or journaling one's thoughts and feelings throughout the research process. So the researcher keeps a journal or a memo about their thoughts and feelings as they're going through the research process. Triangulation is looking for consistency of information across various data sources. So it's important that in qualitative research that we follow these 5 gold standards. Prolonged engagement is spending extensive time in the field to build trust with the participants in order to obtain accurate description of the phenomenon. The drawback is that too much time could lead to bias and loss of objectivity. So if the researcher spends too much time, it can lead to them being biased or even become less objective. Peer debriefing is getting a person outside of the research team who can challenge the findings, the methods employed, and the data analysis strategies used. Transferability involves providing enough detailed description of the research process, the participants, and the settings so that the readers can make decisions about whether the findings are applicable to the individuals they work with or the settings in which they work. So a thick description is a detailed account of the research process, the context, and the participants. The use of multiple cases can determine that the findings have occurred across individuals and settings. Dependability is used when the phenomenon is likely to change depending on the research method, the time, or environment, calling into question the stability of the research. The focus is on demonstrating the consistency of the research process where both research and phenomenon appear to be unstable. With a dependability audit, a third-party auditor is employed to check the work by reviewing the audit trail. A reflexive journal is used to document why certain methodological decisions are made, how codes were created and research questions developed, and why specific sampling decisions were made. Confirmability establishes that findings are derived from the data collected. Confirmability audit trail documents the decisions made throughout the research process. The note of rationale is a process that involves keeping a note of the rationale for how the data were coded and analyzed, the themes were developed, and the interpretations of the findings were made and recorded. For the reflective journal, the researcher should document their biases, thoughts, feelings, and challenges throughout the research process. Authenticity refers to the degree to which the researcher fairly and completely shows a range of the lived experiences or realities of the participants. Authenticity is established by providing thick descriptions. Ethics and diversity in qualitative research. So, qualitative research does require that you use verbatim quotes. So this is the only time that we really want you to use quotes verbatim. So if you are doing a qualitative study and you're writing up results, it is totally okay to use as many verbatim quotes in the results section as possible. It is important that the quotes used to illustrate findings be verbatim. It is unethical, actually, to use modified quotes. So don't modify it, use it word for word. Demonstrating the trustworthiness of the data is considered ethical. Failure to do so can be harmful, especially if findings are used to develop interventions and policies. Ensure participants are anonymous by using pseudonyms when reporting the findings. Disguise any information that might reveal their identity. Mentioning third parties in quotes to illustrate a finding could raise ethical concerns, as a third party may not have given consent for their information to be used in the research. So be careful about that. It is recommended to alter information associated with third parties and noting how this may have affected the research. Lack of focus on diversity in grounded theory research has stifled the development of new theories to address the issues facing diverse populations. This may have affected the advancement of our understanding of the phenomenon under study. As Competency 2 states, it is important to focus on diversity at all stages of the research process. It should be implicit in the research question that diversity is of importance. For example, focus on the lived experiences of Filipino mothers caring for children with special needs. Researchers should consider how the sampling strategy restricted the diversity of the sample. The snowball sampling strategy, which is the most commonly used, tends to yield a homogeneous sample. For a more diverse sample, stratified purposive sampling may be used, which is stratified on racial ethnic background. Also, use researchers from diverse backgrounds who may have access to more diverse communities. So these are some issues with ethics and diversity when conducting a qualitative research. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 8.